At 34, I, Laura, sat in a Northwestern Memorial Hospital wheelchair, awaiting spinal reconstruction, when my father publicly initiated the theft of my home. In the crowded hallway, 12 witnesses watched as Arthur leaned over my 5-year-old daughter and hissed, "Don't get too comfortable, Amaya. Your mother won't need this house where she's going." The scent of floor wax and stale coffee filled the silence. I didn't scream or cry. I felt an icy clarity as I looked into his eyes. I adjusted my daughter's hood and whispered, "Check the math, Dad." My father thought he was witnessing my end, but what happened while I was under anesthesia is what I'm here to tell. 8 hours later, while I was under the heavy fog of anesthesia and a surgical team was reconstructing my spine, my home was sold to a shell company for exactly $425,000. As the orderlies began wheeling my gurney toward the double doors of the operating room, I didn't think about the risks of the procedure or the possibility that I might never walk again. My thumb moved with mechanical precision across the screen of my phone, hitting a preset digital shortcut I had programmed weeks ago. I watched the encrypted message, "Green light," disappear into the ether just as the elevator doors slid shut. My father thought he was witnessing my end, but he was actually triggering a sequence of events he was far too arrogant to predict. To understand why my own father was betting on my death to steal my home, we have to go back to the day my grandmother Rose stopped speaking to him. I watched the nurse's hand tremble as she filed my papers, the $425,000 value of my home already being traded like a commodity in a deal I wasn't supposed to survive. If you have ever stood in a room filled with people who share your blood but feel like vultures waiting for your heart to stop, if you have ever had a family member try to use your weakest moment as an opportunity, hit that like button so I know I am not alone in this silence before I tell you what Grandma Rose left in that rusted safety deposit box. My father thought he was the only one who knew the long game, but he had forgotten the lessons his own mother taught me. To understand the depth of his greedy plan, we have to go back to a humid July afternoon in 2008, the day my grandmother Rose looked at her son and stopped speaking to him forever. Growing up in the red brick house on Orchard Street felt like living inside a balance sheet that never quite added up in my favor. My father, Arthur, didn't just run his real estate firm. He ran our household with the same cold, calculating efficiency he used to foreclose on properties in the late 90s. I remember the exact smell of his home office, expensive mahogany, old paper, and the faint, bitter scent of the cigars he only smoked when a deal was closing. By the time I was 10, I understood that affection was a currency, and my brother Ethan was the only one with a bottomless bank account. While I was expected to maintain a perfect 4.0 GPA and manage the household chores, Ethan was celebrated for simply existing. His failures always brushed under the expensive Persian rugs as minor setbacks. My role was to be the silent backup, the reliable asset that Arthur could leverage whenever the family's stability felt slightly out of balance. In the spring of 2008, when I was 16, I received a thick blue envelope from the National Merit Scholarship Program that should have been my ticket out of that house. It was a $10,000 merit award, a staggering amount of money for a teenager who had spent every summer working at a local library to save for college. I remember holding that check in the kitchen, the sunlight hitting the holographic strip as I imagined the freedom it represented. I thought for a fleeting moment that Arthur would finally see me as an equal, a successful investment in his own image. Instead, he didn't even congratulate me when I showed him the letter. He simply set his coffee mug down on the granite counter, his eyes scanning the numbers with a predatory focus that made my skin crawl. He didn't see my hard work or my future. He saw $10,000 of unallocated capital. That evening, at exactly 6:45 p.m., the atmosphere in the dining room turned icy as Arthur laid the scholarship check on the table between us. He told me, with a voice as flat as a ledger, that the family was facing unforeseen household expenses and that my contribution was mandatory for the greater good. I looked at my mother, Martha, who was busy smoothing the lace tablecloth, her eyes fixed on her plate as if she could disappear into the floral pattern. She whispered that being a good Christian daughter meant sacrifice, but we both knew where that money was actually going. Ethan had crashed his second car in 3 months, and Arthur wanted to buy him a silver 2005 Honda Civic to keep him from complaining. It wasn't a request. It was a demand phrased as a moral obligation. I felt the first real crack in my loyalty that night. When I hesitated to pick up the pen to sign the check over to him, Arthur leaned forward, his shadow engulfing my side of the table. He didn't yell or wave his arms. He just lowered his voice to that vibrating growl that would haunt my nightmares for decades. "You wouldn't have anything without my name, Laura," he hissed, the words landing like heavy stones in the quiet room. It was the first time he used that specific phrase, a verbal branding meant to remind me that my very existence was a debt I owed to him. I signed the check with a hand that didn't tremble, even though my heart was hammering against my ribs like a trapped bird. I watched the ink dry on my own signature, realizing then that my father didn't love me. He merely owned me. That $10,000 lesson was the most expensive education I ever received. Ethan got his car the following Saturday, a shiny silver trophy of my stolen future, while I started working double shifts at the library to make up the difference. My brother never even thanked me, driving off with a smirk that mirrored Arthur's own arrogance, leaving a trail of exhaust in our driveway. Martha continued her silent ministry of complicity, baking pies and hosting Bible studies while ignoring the systematic theft of my independence right under her roof. I learned to stop talking about my dreams or my achievements, keeping my grades and my bank account balances hidden like state secrets. I became a ghost in my own home, a senior risk assessment analyst in training, though I didn't have the title yet. I was already auditing every interaction, looking for the loopholes Arthur used to keep us all under his thumb. I was waiting for the right moment to finally disappear. The only person who saw through the charade was my Grandma Rose, Martha's mother, who lived in a small, cedar-scented bungalow in Oak Park. She was a woman of few words and sharp eyes, someone who had survived the Great Depression and knew the difference between a provider and a parasite. Whenever I visited her, she would sit me down with a cup of peppermint tea and look at my hands, checking for the tension I couldn't hide. She never spoke ill of Arthur directly. That wasn't her way. But she would tell me stories about people who built their houses on sand and greed. "Watch your signatures, Laura," she whispered to me one rainy afternoon in 2012. "A name on a piece of paper can be a shield or a noose, and your father only knows how to tie knots." She was the only one who didn't want anything from me. By the time I turned 25 in 2014, I had managed to put myself through college and land a junior position at a global insurance firm downtown. I married Mark in a small ceremony that Arthur tried to turn into a networking event for his real estate cronies, but I blocked him. Mark was a structural engineer, a man who understood foundations and stability, the exact opposite of the shifting, manipulative ground I had grown up on. We lived in a modest apartment in Lincoln Park, and for 5 years, I thought I had finally escaped the orbit of the Miller family's toxic gravity. Arthur stayed at a distance, mostly because I refused to give him access to our joint accounts or my husband's professional connections. He viewed my marriage not as a union of love, but as a hostile takeover of one of his primary assets. He was just waiting for a weakness. That weakness arrived on a Tuesday in November 2019, when a sheet of black ice on I-90 changed the trajectory of my life in a single second. Mark was coming home from a site inspection when a semi-truck lost control, and just like that, the foundation of my world was pulverized into gray slush. I remember the hospital room, the smell of antiseptic, and the crushing weight of the $500,000 life insurance policy that suddenly sat in my lap. I was 30 years old, a widow, and drowning in a grief so heavy I could barely breathe, let alone manage a complex estate. That was the moment Arthur decided to stage his rescue, appearing at my door with a folder full of legal documents and a look of practiced sympathy. He didn't come to mourn my husband. He came to manage the payout I wasn't emotional enough to handle. During the funeral preparations, while I was trying to choose a casket through a fog of tears, Arthur cornered me in the back of the funeral home. He spoke in hushed, urgent tones about the burden of financial management and the risks of unscrupulous predators targeting young widows like myself. He conveniently ignored the fact that he was the primary predator in the room, his eyes darting toward my designer handbag where I kept the insurance papers. "You wouldn't have anything without my name, Laura," he repeated, his voice a low, vibrating growl that cut through my morning like a serrated knife. He wanted to be the executor, the gatekeeper, the one who decided how every cent of Mark's legacy was spent. I felt the walls of the small room closing in, the same feeling I had at 16 when I signed over my scholarship. But this time, I said no. My refusal sparked a cold war within the family that lasted for the next 2 years, with Martha calling me daily to weep about my disrespect for Arthur's wisdom. Ethan, meanwhile, was burning through another $100,000 of our parents' retirement savings on a failed ecotech startup that sold overpriced bamboo chargers. Arthur's pride was wounded because he couldn't control the roof over my head or the balance in my bank account, and he took it out on everyone. He stopped inviting me to Sunday dinners, which was a blessing, but he also started poisoning the extended family's perception of me, calling me unstable and cold. I focused entirely on my work and my daughter, Maya, who had Mark's eyes and a tattered stuffed bunny named Barnaby that she took everywhere. I was building a fortress of independence, brick by painful brick, while Arthur watched from the sidelines. On June 12, 2021, I finally used my savings and a portion of the insurance money to purchase a 3-bedroom condo in the Gold Coast for $425,000. It was a beautiful, sun-drenched space with a view of Lake Michigan that felt like a long overdue deep breath after years of suffocating. When Arthur found out about the purchase, he didn't ask to see the place or offer a bottle of champagne to celebrate my new home. Instead, he showed up uninvited while I was still unpacking boxes, his boots tracking mud across the pristine hardwood floors as he performed a silent audit. He checked the crown molding, the stainless steel appliances, and the security system with a grimace of pure envy. To him, this wasn't my success. It was a resource that was currently out of his reach. He was calculating the market value. The atmosphere at the housewarming party I eventually threw was thick with unspoken resentment from the Miller side of the family, especially from my brother Ethan. He spent the entire evening complaining about the unfairness of the tech market, while sipping my expensive scotch and eyeing the artwork on my walls. Arthur stood on the balcony, staring out at the lake with a look of intense concentration, as if he were planning a siege on a fortified castle. He didn't say a word to me until everyone else had left, cornering me in the kitchen as I was loading the dishwasher. "A house this size is a lot of responsibility for a single woman," he said, his voice dripping with condescending concern. "What happens if you get sick, Laura? Who handles the paperwork then?" He wasn't asking out of love. He was planting the seeds for the next trap. By early 2023, the financial pressure on the Miller household reached a breaking point as Ethan's creditors began calling the Orchard Street house at all hours of the night. My brother had managed to lose nearly $200,000 of Arthur's remaining liquid assets on a series of guaranteed cryptocurrency investments that vanished overnight. The golden boy was tarnished, and the family patriarch was looking for a way to replenish the coffers without admitting failure to his social circle. I started receiving frantic texts from Martha about saving the family legacy and protecting your brother from his own mistakes, which I ignored with surgical precision. I knew exactly where this was headed, but I didn't realize how low Arthur was willing to sink to secure the $425,000 he needed. He started asking about my health, feigning interest in my recurring back pain. The back pain wasn't a minor issue. It was a degenerative spinal condition that had been worsening since Maya was born, eventually requiring a high-risk 8-hour reconstruction surgery. When I finally received the diagnosis and the surgical date at Northwestern Memorial, I made the mistake of informing my mother during a moment of rare vulnerability. Within 24 hours, Arthur was at my door with a new set of documents, claiming he wanted to simplify my life while I was in recovery. He presented a limited power of attorney, a document he insisted was just for emergencies, to handle the condo's mortgage and utilities if the surgery went wrong. Martha stood behind him, clutching her pearls and whispering about how much Arthur cared, her voice a fragile weapon used to guilt me into compliance. I felt the familiar trap snapping shut around my ankles. I remember sitting at my glass dining table on September 14th, staring at the lines of the power of attorney while the late afternoon sun hit the lake. I was exhausted, terrified of the upcoming surgery, and desperate for just a few weeks of peace so I could focus on Maya's well-being. Arthur's pitch was perfect. He played the role of the protective father with such conviction that I almost believed he had changed his ways. He promised the POA would only be used if I was incapacitated, and that it was a standard procedure for someone facing major medical intervention. I looked at Maya, who was playing with Barnaby on the rug, and for a split second, I wanted to trust him. I signed the document, thinking it was the price of keeping the peace during my most vulnerable month. I was wrong. The moment the ink was dry on that power of attorney, the mask Arthur had been wearing for the past 2 years slipped just enough for me to see the rot underneath. He didn't leave the document on the table. He snatched it up and tucked it into his leather briefcase with a speed that felt violent. There was no "thank you" or "I love you." Just a curt nod and a reminder that he would take care of everything while I was under anesthesia. I watched him walk out the door, his gait more confident than it had been in months, and a cold shiver that had nothing to do with my spinal injury ran down my back. I realized that I hadn't bought peace. I had handed my father the keys to my execution. He finally had his legal loophole. Grandma Rose's health began to fail rapidly during that same period, her sharp mind finally succumbing to the wear and tear of 92 years of hard living. I visited her in the hospice care facility 3 weeks before my scheduled surgery, her room filled with the scent of sterile linens and the faded roses Martha brought. She was drifting in and out of sleep, but when she saw me, her eyes cleared with a terrifying intensity that made the machines beside her beep. She reached out and grabbed my wrist with surprising strength, her skin like parchment paper against mine, pulling me close to her ear. "Don't trust the paper, Laura," she rasped, her voice a dry whisper that sounded like dead leaves skittering across a sidewalk. "The safety deposit box. The key is in the blue book. Do it now." I found the key exactly where she said it would be, tucked inside a hollowed-out copy of Great Expectations on the top shelf of her Oak Park bungalow. It was a heavy brass key for a box at the First National Bank of Chicago, a relic from a time when people didn't trust digital clouds or paper promises. I went to the bank the following morning, my back screaming with every step as I followed the teller into the subterranean vault where the air was cold and still. When I opened the box, I didn't find jewelry or gold bars. I found a stack of digital SD cards and a handwritten note from Rose. She had been secretly recording Arthur for months, catching his admissions of fraud and his detailed plans to liquidate my assets the moment I went under. She had provided the evidence I needed. The recordings were chilling, capturing Arthur's voice in the quiet of his Orchard Street office as he spoke to Ethan about the imminent liquidation of my home. He described the Gold Coast condo not as my residence, but as a $425,000 solution to Ethan's mounting legal problems and business debts. He joked about how easy it would be to use the power of attorney while I was drugged up in the hospital, confident that I wouldn't survive the surgery anyway. My mother's voice was there too, a soft murmur of agreement as she asked if they should wait at least a week before moving my things out. Listening to those tapes felt like being dissected while I was still alive, the people who raised me discussing my life as if it were a carcass. I didn't confront them immediately. I was a risk assessment analyst, and I knew that a premature reaction would only give Arthur time to pivot his strategy. Instead, I took the SD cards to a man named Mr. Sterling, a forensic accountant and attorney who specialized in cases of fiduciary abuse and elder exploitation. We met in a dimly lit office in the Loop, surrounded by stacks of case files that represented the dark side of family dynamics. Sterling listened to the recordings without changing his expression, his silver pen tapping a rhythmic beat on his mahogany desk as he took notes. "Your father is arrogant, Laura," he said, his voice a calm contrast to the chaos in my chest. "Arrogant men leave trails of breadcrumbs because they don't believe anyone is smart enough to follow them. We are going to follow them." We spent the next 2 weeks building a emergency protocol that Arthur would never see coming, a silent counteroffensive designed to trigger the moment he attempted to use the POA. I signed a secret revocation of the power of attorney and filed it with the county recorder, but I didn't notify my father, as was my legal right under specific Illinois statutes. I also transferred the deed of the condo into a private trust that required a dual signature authorization from an independent trustee, Mr. Sterling himself. Every night, I would talk to Maya and Barnaby, pretending everything was normal while I prepared for a war that would be fought in the shadows of my own surgery. Arthur continued to call, his voice dripping with false concern as he checked in on my hospital arrival time. He was counting the minutes. The Sunday before the surgery, Arthur insisted on a family blessing dinner at the Orchard Street house, a grotesque performance of unity that made my stomach turn. Martha had prepared a roast chicken, and the table was set with the fine china she only used for special occasions or to mask a brewing crisis. Ethan was there, looking jittery and avoiding my gaze, his fingers twitching as he checked his phone for messages from his creditors. Arthur led a prayer for my safe recovery, his hand resting heavily on my shoulder in a gesture that felt more like a claim of ownership than a blessing. He talked about the sanctity of family, while he was likely already coordinating with the shell company that would buy my home. I played my role perfectly, nodding and smiling like the compliant daughter he thought he had broken. During that dinner, I watched Arthur pour a glass of expensive red wine, the deep crimson liquid catching the light from the chandelier like a pool of blood. He looked across the table at me, his eyes narrowing as he repeated the phrase that had been his mantra since I was a child. "You wouldn't have anything without my name, Laura," he said, the words now carrying a dark, anticipatory edge that made the hair on my arms stand up. He was already spending the $425,000 in his head, mentally clearing Ethan's debts and restoring his own shattered pride. I didn't argue or defend my achievements. I simply took a sip of water and looked at the clock on the wall. It was 8:15 p.m., and in exactly 36 hours, I would be entering the hospital for the surgery he bet I wouldn't survive. I spent the night before the surgery at my condo, walking through each room and touching the walls as if I were memorizing the layout of a dream I was about to lose. I packed a small bag for Maya, making sure Barnaby the bunny was tucked safely inside her bright yellow raincoat so she would have her symbol of security. I felt a strange, icy clarity wash over me, a detachment from the emotional betrayal that allowed me to focus on the technical execution of my plan. I wasn't a victim. I was a strategist, and I had been trained by the best predator in Chicago to anticipate every move. I set up the digital shortcut on my phone, a green light out message that would alert Mr. Sterling the moment I checked into the hospital. The trap was set, but it wasn't for me. It was for the man who shared my blood. The drive to Northwestern Memorial at 5:30 a.m. on Tuesday was silent, the city of Chicago still shrouded in a gray mist that felt like a physical weight on my chest. Maya was asleep in the back seat, her small hand clutching Barnaby's tattered ear as we passed the familiar landmarks of the Gold Coast. I knew that within 8 hours, while I was unconscious on a surgical table, my father would attempt to sell the roof over my daughter's head. I knew he had already prepared the paperwork for a shell company called Orchard Development to purchase the condo for a fraction of its market value. He thought he was playing a game of checkers, but I had been playing chess against him since I was 16 years old. I pulled into the hospital parking garage, my hand steady as I turned off the ignition and took a final deep breath. Walking into that sterile waiting room at 6 a.m. felt like entering the arena for the final confrontation of a war that had been raging for 2 decades. The fluorescent lights flickered with that rhythmic countdown, and the smell of floor wax was a reminder of all the times I had been diminished in clinical, cold spaces. Arthur was already there, standing by the orange plastic chairs like a king waiting for his subject to bow before him. He didn't see a daughter facing a life-altering surgery. He saw a closing window of opportunity that he needed to exploit before I regained my strength. I sat down and began the process of signing the admission forms, my thumb hovering over the phone screen for just a second. I looked at Maya, who was now awake and clutching her bunny, and I knew that whatever happened in that operating room, the house was already safe. The hallway outside the pre-op suite at 6:10 a.m. was a gauntlet of forced smiles and shallow breathing. 12 of us were squeezed into that narrow corridor, a grotesque assembly of the Miller bloodline pretending to offer support while mentally dividing up my estate. I could see my brother Ethan leaning against the beige wallpaper, his fingers rhythmically tapping against his thigh as he avoided looking at my surgical gown. My mother, Martha, was clutching her prayer beads so tightly her knuckles were translucent, her lips moving in a silent, performative plea for a miracle she didn't actually want. The air was thick with the scent of industrial-grade lavender and the metallic tang of fear that always precedes a major reconstruction. I sat in a wheelchair, my spine held together by sheer willpower and a high dosage of pre-surgical sedatives, watching the digital clock on the wall tick toward my 6:45 a.m. intake. I was the subject of their vigil, yet I felt like the only person truly alive in that room. Arthur wasn't looking at me. He was looking at a folded sheet of paper he'd pulled from his expensive leather briefcase, a printout from a real estate portal showing the Gold Coast's peak market valuations. He had circled the $425,000 figure in thick, red ink, a target he had been aiming for since the moment I signed that limited power of attorney. He paced the small area in front of the nurse's station, his polished wingtips clicking against the linoleum with a predatory rhythm that made the younger staff members visibly uncomfortable. He was talking to Ethan in a low, urgent whisper about closing windows and market liquidity, treating my medical crisis like a minor administrative hurdle in a much larger acquisition strategy. I watched him, recording every predatory movement, every greedy glance toward my handbag where my house keys were buried deep. He thought the heavy fog of my impending surgery made me blind to the ledger he was currently balancing in his mind. Maya was huddled on the floor at my feet, her bright yellow raincoat a splash of defiant color against the drab hospital surroundings. She was exhausted, her small face pale and pinched from the early hour and the palpable tension radiating from the adults surrounding her. She reached up and tugged on the hem of my hospital gown, her other hand deathly tight around the matted neck of Barnaby, the stuffed bunny that had seen us through every storm. "Mommy, will we go home tomorrow?" she whispered, her voice a fragile thread that seemed to pull the air out of the room. It was the simplest question in the world, born of a 5-year-old's need for the safety of her own bed and the smell of the Lake Michigan breeze through our balcony door. The silence that followed her question was heavy and suffocating, as if the walls themselves were waiting for an answer I wasn't allowed to give in that specific, cruel company. Arthur didn't let me answer. He chose that exact second to drop the mask of the doting grandfather and reveal the predator beneath. He leaned over Maya, his massive shadow completely engulfing her small frame, the smell of his expensive mahogany aftershave mixing sickeningly with the hospital's sterile air. He didn't just speak. He spat the words with a vibrating growl that vibrated through the metal of my wheelchair and into my damaged spine. "Don't get too comfortable, Maya. Your mother won't need this house where she's going, he hissed, his eyes fixed on the child's terrified face rather than mine. The nurse at the intake station let out a sharp gasp, her silver pen clattering onto the desk as the 12 people in that hallway went deathly still. It was a moment of pure, unadulterated cruelty, a public branding of my daughter as a homeless orphan before I was even on the operating table. I felt the icy clarity of my grandmother Rose's legacy settle into my bones, a cold fire that replaced the fear I should have been feeling. I didn't scream, I didn't cry, and I certainly didn't implore him to take back the words that had just shattered my daughter's sense of security. I simply looked at my father, seeing the rot behind his eyes and the desperate greed that drove a man to threaten a child to save a failing business. The silence in the hallway was so absolute that I could hear the rhythmic hum of the air conditioning and the distant, muffled sound of a heart monitor from a nearby room. I reached down and gently smoothed the matted fur on Barnaby's head, my touch steady and deliberate, a silent promise to my daughter that the walls of her home were stronger than the man standing over us. I was no longer a daughter. I was a senior risk assessment analyst auditing a total loss. Dad, leave. Now, I said, my voice a flat, surgical whisper that carried more weight than any shout ever could. I didn't blink as I watched his smug expression falter for a microsecond, his hand twitching toward the briefcase where he kept the power of attorney he believed was his golden ticket. He tried to laugh it off, a dry, barking sound that lacked any genuine humor, looking around at the 12 witnesses as if expecting them to join in his mockery. You're just emotional, Laura. The surgery is getting to your head, he countered, his voice dripping with that same condescending arrogance that had defined my childhood. He thought he still held the cards, unaware that the green light message I had sent to Mr. Sterling moments earlier had already triggered a sequence of legal events he was too stupid to predict. I didn't argue with him. I just stared until he finally looked away, his bravado crumbling under the weight of my silent, calculated gaze. The orderlies arrived at exactly 6:42 a.m., their movements mechanical and efficient as they began the process of transferring me from the wheelchair to the cold metal gurney. I felt the physical shift of power as they wheeled me toward the double doors, the fluorescent lights above passing over me like a series of rhythmic flashes in a dark room. My mother tried to reach out and touch my hand, but I pulled away, her silent complicity making her touch feel like a layer of grease on my skin. I watched the hallway recede, the 12 figures of my toxic family becoming smaller and smaller as the heavy doors swung shut behind us. The nurse who had witnessed the confrontation stayed by my side, her hand resting on my shoulder, in a way that felt like a real human connection amidst the wreckage. My thumb moved one last time across my phone screen, confirming the timestamp of my final, decisive directive before the device was taken. By the time the anesthesia mask was lowered over my face in the operating room, my heart rate was a steady, rhythmic 65 beats per minute. I breathed in the chemical sweetness of the gas, feeling the heavy fog of unconsciousness begin to pull at the edges of my vision as the surgical team prepared their instruments. My last conscious thought wasn't about the 8-hour reconstruction of my spine, or the possibility that I might never walk again. It was about the math Arthur had failed to check. In exactly 8 hours, while he was finalizing the illegal sale of my $425,000 condo to his shell company, the trap I had built would snap shut. He thought he was witnessing the end of my life, but he was actually watching the beginning of his own destruction. I closed my eyes as the darkness took hold. The phantom image of Barnaby, the bunny standing guard over a home he would never truly touch again. The first 48 hours after the reconstruction were a blur of white ceilings and the rhythmic hiss of a morphine pump. My body felt like it had been dismantled and reassembled with titanium bolts, a heavy, throbbing weight that made every breath a calculated effort. At exactly 3:14 p.m. on Friday, the heavy fog of anesthesia finally lifted enough for me to see Mr. Sterling sitting in the corner of my private room, his silver hair catching the late afternoon sun. He didn't offer empty platitudes or ask how I was feeling. He simply opened his leather briefcase and pulled out a single, notarized document that smelled faintly of old parchment and ink. The green light message I had sent at 6:15 a.m. on Tuesday had successfully initiated the firewall we had spent 3 weeks constructing in secret. While my father believed I was drifting toward a permanent silence, my legal team was already dismantling the very ground he stood upon with surgical precision. Mr. Sterling informed me that at 10:45 a.m. on Wednesday, while the surgical team was still fusing my vertebrae, Arthur had attempted to execute the sale of my Gold Coast condo. He had arrived at a downtown title company with a representative from Orchard Development, a shell company he had created specifically to absorb my $425,000 of equity. He presented the limited power of attorney with a smug confidence that suggested he had already spent the commissions in his head, his hands steady as he prepared to sign away the roof over my daughter's head. He didn't know that at 2 a.m. on Monday, I had filed a formal revocation of that power with the Cook County Recorder of Deeds, a document that had been time-stamped and digitized long before he even woke up. The look on his face when the title officer informed him the transaction was flagged as fraudulent was a detail I wished I could have witnessed in person. The revocation was only the first layer of the defense Grandma Rose had helped me build from beyond the grave. Mr. Sterling pulled out a sleek black laptop and played the first file from the SD card I had recovered from the safety deposit box. The audio was crisp, capturing Arthur's vibrating growl as he sat in his mahogany-paneled office 2 months prior, explaining to Ethan exactly how they would circumvent the trust. He spoke about my potential death as a financial windfall, a liquidation event that would solve Ethan's $200,000 debt to a group of private lenders. Listening to my own father calculate the profit margin on my demise felt like being submerged in ice water, but I didn't let a single tear fall. I watched the waveform on the screen, a digital heartbeat of a betrayal that was now officially recorded evidence. Grandma Rose had known he would record himself. His own arrogance was his greatest vulnerability. By Friday evening, the fallout from the failed sale began to move through the Miller family like a slow-moving landslide. Because the sale of my condo was the only collateral Arthur had promised to Ethan's creditors, the moment the transaction was frozen, the dominoes began to fall. Mr. Sterling had already shared the recordings and the evidence of fiduciary abuse with the state's attorney's office, triggering an immediate freeze on all of Arthur's liquid assets. The $425,000 he thought he had secured was now a phantom, leaving him exposed to the very men he had tried to appease. I sat in my hospital bed, the smell of antiseptic and cold air surrounding me, and watched as a series of emails arrived from the forensic team. Every hidden account, every redirected fund from my mother's retirement, and every fraudulent real estate transfer was being mapped out by Mr. Sterling's ruthless associates. At exactly 6 p.m. on Saturday, a process server arrived at the red brick house on Orchard Street, delivering a summons that would change the trajectory of my father's life forever. Arthur was being hit with a felony fraud charge, specifically focused on the unauthorized use of a revoked power of attorney to facilitate a predatory land transfer. The local police department had also opened an investigation into the shell company, Orchard Development, which turned out to be a poorly veiled front for money laundering and tax evasion. My mother, Martha, finally broke her silence, calling my phone 68 times in a single hour, her voice on the voicemails shifting from frantic pleading to incoherent rage. I didn't answer a single call. Instead, I handed the phone to a nurse and asked her to place it in the bedside drawer. The time for listening to her complicit prayers had ended when she watched Arthur threaten my child. Ethan's creditors were not as patient as the legal system, and they arrived at my father's real estate firm on Monday morning to collect on their shattered promises. Without the influx of cash from my home, Arthur was forced to watch as his remaining commercial properties were hit with emergency liens and foreclosure notices. The $300,000 office building he had owned for 20 years was seized within 48 hours, the glass doors locked and plastered with legal notices for all of Chicago to see. His reputation, the only thing he valued more than money, was being shredded in the public record as his peers realized he had tried to rob his own bedridden daughter. I received a detailed report from Mr. Sterling showing that Arthur's net worth had plummeted by 65% in less than a week. The hunter had become the prey, trapped in a financial cage of his own design. The most satisfying consequence was the forensic audit of Grandma Rose's estate, which revealed that Arthur had been skimming off the top of her healthcare funds for nearly 5 years. He had stolen exactly $82,000 from his own mother's care to fund Ethan's failed startups and luxury car payments. When this evidence was presented to the probate court, the judge immediately stripped Arthur of his remaining executorship and appointed Mr. Sterling as the special administrator. This move effectively cut my father off from the last source of family wealth he hadn't already liquidated or lost. I felt a strange sense of peace as I read the court order, imagining Grandma Rose's sharp eyes watching from wherever she was. She had known that the paper trail would eventually lead back to the truth, and she had trusted me to follow it to the very end. Maya stayed with a trusted friend from my firm during the first week of my recovery, and we spoke every night via video call. She still had Barnaby with her, the bunny's tattered ear a constant reminder of the vulnerability we had survived in that hospital hallway. I told her that we were going to a special place for a few weeks, a quiet clinic where the air was clean and the doctors would help me walk again. She didn't ask about her grandfather or the red brick house on Orchard Street. She only wanted to know if her yellow raincoat would fit in the suitcase. Her innocence was the only asset I was truly determined to protect, and with every legal victory, Mr. Sterling reported, that protection became a solid, impenetrable wall. The $425,000 condo was officially back in my trust, unencumbered and safe from the vultures. On the 10th day post-surgery, I was transferred to a private rehabilitation facility in the suburbs, a place Arthur and Martha would never be able to find. Mr. Sterling had arranged for a security detail to monitor the entrance, ensuring that no member of the Miller family could get within 500 feet of my room. My father had attempted to file a countersuit claiming I was mentally incompetent due to the surgery, but the judge had dismissed it within 10 minutes after reviewing the hospital's cognitive assessments. He was now facing the very real possibility of a 5-year prison sentence for his financial crimes. His once powerful voice reduced to a desperate whine in the transcripts of his preliminary hearings. He was discovering that the name he had tried to use as a weapon against me was now a brand of shame he couldn't escape. Martha's fall from grace was just as absolute, as her good Christian at social circle in Oak Park discovered the depth of Arthur's fraud and her own silent involvement. The women she had hosted for Bible studies for 20 years stopped answering her texts, and the local charity board she chaired asked for her immediate resignation. She was left in a quiet, empty house that was rapidly being stripped of its finery to pay for Arthur's mounting legal fees and Ethan's debts. Mr. Sterling estimated that they would be forced to sell the Orchard Street property within the next 90 days just to avoid total bankruptcy. The mahogany furniture, the fine china, and the Persian rugs were all being cataloged for auction, symbols of a lifestyle built on the systematic exploitation of their own children. She had chosen her husband's greed over her daughter's life, and now she had neither. Ethan, the golden boy who had started this entire sequence of events, was nowhere to be found, having reportedly fled to a friend's basement in another state to avoid his creditors. He had left behind a trail of shattered businesses and unpaid employees, his name now a warning to every investor in the city. He had spent his entire life being shielded from the consequences of his failures, but the shield had finally shattered under the weight of his father's crimes. There would be no more silver cars or secret payouts from my scholarship funds to bail him out this time. He was 30 years old and possessed nothing but the clothes on his back and a growing list of people who wanted their money back. I didn't feel pity for him. I only felt the weight of the $10,000 he had stolen from me 16 years ago. The legal process moved with a cold, mechanical inevitability that Arthur couldn't manipulate with his usual charms or threats. Every time he tried to lie to a prosecutor, Mr. Sterling would produce another recording or another bank statement that contradicted his testimony. By the end of the second week, his lead attorney had resigned due to non-payment, leaving him to face the felony charges with a public defender who had no interest in his family patriarch persona. He was being processed like any other criminal, his fingerprints taken and his photograph added to a database he once thought he was above. The $425,000 he had tried to steal had become the anchor that was dragging him into the depths of a legal nightmare he wouldn't survive. I watched the updates on the case from my quiet room, feeling nothing but a profound, hollow relief. I spent my afternoons in physical therapy, learning to move my legs with a precision that mirrored the legal work Mr. Sterling was performing in the city. The pain was still intense, a sharp, electric reminder of the reconstruction, but it was a productive pain that signaled the beginning of a new foundation. I thought about the phrase Arthur had repeated since I was 10, about how I wouldn't have anything without his name, and I realized how wrong he was. Everything I had, my daughter's safety, my home, my career, and my dignity, I had built myself, often in direct opposition to him. His name wasn't a gift, it was a debt I had finally paid in full with the currency of truth. I was no longer an asset on his balance sheet. I was the auditor who had closed his accounts for good. The total number of missed calls on my phone had surpassed 400 by the time I finally decided to have the number changed permanently. I didn't need to hear their voices to know what they were saying. I had already listened to the truth on Grandma Rose's SD cards. They were no longer my family. They were merely defendants in a series of civil and criminal cases that would occupy the next several years of their lives. I focused instead on the smell of the lavender oil the therapists used and the sound of Maya's laughter through the phone each evening. The fortress I had built was finally complete, its walls reinforced with the legacy of a woman who had taught me that a name on a piece of paper is only as strong as the integrity behind it. The ink was dry, and the deal was closed. As the sun set over the quiet suburban landscape on my final day at the clinic, I took my first unassisted steps toward the window, My spine felt strong, supported by the titanium and the willpower that had seen me through the darkest hours of my life. I looked out at the horizon, knowing that when I returned to the Gold Coast, there would be no vultures waiting for me in the hallway. Barnaby the bunny would be there, and Maya would be wearing her yellow raincoat, and the $425,000 condo would finally be a home instead of a target. I had survived the surgery and the betrayal, and for the first time in 34 years, I was truly free. My father had been right about one thing. I didn't need that house where I was going, because I was going somewhere he could never follow. The smell of rosemary and roasting chicken filled the sun-drenched kitchen of my Gold Coast condo at exactly 6 p.m. on a snowy Tuesday. Outside the floor-to-ceiling windows, the Chicago winter was painting the city in shades of slate and ivory, the flakes drifting silently toward the frozen expanse of Lake Michigan. It was a stark, beautiful contrast to the flickering fluorescent lights and the clinical smell of floor wax that had defined my life just a few months ago. My back didn't ache as I leaned against the marble counter, the titanium rods providing a solid, silent foundation that felt more reliable than any promise my father had ever made. I watched the timer on the oven tick down with a rhythmic precision that no longer felt like a countdown to a disaster, but rather a heartbeat of a life finally reclaimed. The air was warm, scented with lavender and cedar, a fortress of domestic peace that I had defended with the cold calculation of a survivor. Maya was curled up on the velvet sofa in the living room, her small frame rising and falling in the deep, uncomplicated sleep of a child who feels entirely safe. She wasn't wearing her bright yellow raincoat anymore. Instead, she was wrapped in a soft wool blanket the color of a summer sky, her face peaceful and untroubled by the vultures that had once circled her. I stood in the doorway for a long moment, simply breathing in the sight of her, realizing that the greatest victory wasn't the $425,000 or the legal destruction of Arthur's reputation. It was this silence. It was the fact that she would never again have to squeeze a stuffed toy until her knuckles turned white because of a man's vibrating growl. She was no longer a piece of collateral in a game of real estate chess. She was a 5-year-old girl dreaming of snowmen and hot cocoa, protected by a mother who had learned to audit the soul. On the wall directly above the sofa, Barnaby the bunny sat inside a custom-made walnut shadow box, his tattered gray ear and matted fur preserved behind museum-grade glass. I had spent $200 to have him professionally cleaned and mounted, not as a toy to be played with, but as a silent monument to the vulnerability we had survived together. He looked different in the soft glow of the lighting, no longer a symbol of fear and desperation, but a trophy of a war that had been fought with spreadsheets and secret recordings instead of screams. Maya had a new, pristine white bunny that she slept with now, but she always touched the glass of the shadow box before bed, a silent ritual of acknowledgement for the old friend who had stood guard in the hospital hallway. Barnaby was a relic of the debt I had finally paid in full, a reminder that even the most broken things can find a place of honor when the storm has passed. I realized then that family isn't a biological mandate or a blood bond that grants someone the right to dismantle your life for their own convenience. It is, in its truest form, a fiduciary duty of the heart, a commitment to protect and preserve the assets of the soul with the same rigor one would apply to a billion-dollar insurance portfolio. My father had viewed me as a liquid resource, a ledger entry to be manipulated whenever his own vanity or Ethan's incompetence created a deficit in his world. By removing the parasite, I hadn't lost a father. I had simply corrected a long-standing accounting error that had been draining my emotional reserves for 34 years. Everything I had built, my career, my home, and my daughter's safety, was the result of my own labor, independent of the toxic gravity of the Miller name. I had finally learned that the only inheritance that matters is the strength to walk away from the people who claim to love you. The red brick house on Orchard Street was being sold at auction next week to cover the mountain of legal fees and debts Arthur had accumulated in his desperate attempt to crush me. The mahogany furniture, the fine china, and the Persian rugs that had once defined my childhood were being cataloged by strangers, their value reduced to a series of line items in a bankruptcy filing. My mother, Martha, had retreated to a small apartment in a town I didn't care to visit, her social circle and her good Christian reputation shattered by the revelations of her husband's fraud. She had chosen her husband's greed over her daughter's life, and now she was left with neither, a silent witness to the total liquidation of the legacy she had tried so hard to protect. I didn't feel pity for her, or for the house that had once been a prison of high expectations and cold balance sheets. It was just a building. 3 days ago, I had sat behind a thick pane of reinforced glass in a state correctional facility, looking at the man who had once been the center of my terrifying universe. Arthur looked smaller in his orange jumpsuit, The arrogance that had once filled a room now replaced by a frantic, all-hollow desperation that made him look his full 70 years. He didn't have his leather briefcase or his mahogany-scented aftershave. He only had the cold, mechanical reality of a 5-year sentence for felony fraud and fiduciary abuse. He tried to speak to me through the intercom, his voice a pathetic shadow of the vibrating growl he had used to threaten Maya at the hospital. He pleaded for me to drop the civil suits, still believing that I was the same compliant daughter who would sign away her future to keep the peace. He didn't understand that I wasn't there to negotiate. I was there to provide the final audit of his failure. I waited until he ran out of breath, my expression as flat and surgical as a dial tone as I leaned toward the microphone to deliver the final blow. I didn't yell or throw accusations. I simply repeated the words he had hissed at my daughter while I was at my most vulnerable. I hope you found a way to get comfortable, Dad, because you won't need that house on Orchard Street where you're going, I said, the phrase now resignified by the reality of the bars behind him. The look of pure, impotent rage that crossed his face was the last thing I saw before I stood up and walked away, the heavy metal door clicking shut with a finality that felt like a benediction. He was the one who was truly homeless now, trapped in a structure he couldn't manipulate, while the $425,000 condo he had tried to steal remained a fortress of light for my child. Walking back to my car through the crisp afternoon air, I felt the strength of the titanium in my spine, a silent internal architecture that would hold me upright for the rest of my days. I was no longer an asset without a name. I was the architect of my own safety, a woman who had used the very tools of her oppression to build a life of absolute independence. I didn't feel the need for vengeance or the heat of a lingering anger. I only felt a profound, hollow relief that allowed me to finally breathe without calculating the cost of the oxygen. The legal battles were over, the documents were notarized, and the legacy of Grandma Rose had been honored in the most concrete way possible. I had survived the predator, the surgery, and the systematic betrayal of the people who were supposed to be my home. I was 34 years old, and I didn't owe anyone a single cent of my future. Now, as the oven timer finally dings and the snow continues its silent descent over the Gold Coast, I look at the shadow box on the wall and feel a sense of peace that is as solid as the marble beneath my feet. Maya stirs in her sleep, reaching out for her new bunny, her breath steady and rhythmic in the quiet room that belongs entirely to us. I realize that the greatest lesson I ever learned wasn't found in a manual or an insurance policy, but in the cold, clear eyes of a grandmother who knew when to stop talking and start recording. My father had spent 20 years trying to convince me that I was nothing without his name, unaware that I was busy building a fortress he could never hope to breach. They thought my silence was weakness, but I was just waiting for the ink to dry on their final, public destruction. I have spent a significant portion of my 34 years believing that the blood running through my veins was a binding contract I could never rescind, a debt of loyalty that superseded my own safety and peace. We are taught from a very young age that family is a sanctuary, a place where the doors are always locked against the outside world to keep us safe from predators. But as a risk assessment analyst, I have learned that the most dangerous liabilities are often the ones sitting at your own dinner table, smiling while they calculate the market value of your misery. True family is not a biological mandate or a surname printed on a birth certificate. It is a fiduciary duty of the heart that must be earned every single day through transparency and integrity. If the people who raised you view your success as a resource to be exploited and your vulnerability as a window of opportunity, they have already defaulted on that sacred contract without a second thought. If you are listening to this and you feel that familiar, icy chill in your chest, the one that comes from realizing the people who are supposed to be your foundation are actually the ones trying to pull the bricks out from under you, I want you to know that your intuition is your greatest asset. We often ignore the red flags because we are told that family is everything, but that phrase is frequently used as a weapon by those who have nothing else to offer but manipulation and guilt. You are not cold for setting boundaries, and you are not difficult for refusing to hand over the keys to your life to someone who hasn't proven they can handle their own. The betrayal you feel at your weakest moment is not a reflection of your worth, but a final audit of their character. You have the right to revoke their access to your world the moment they treat your life like a liquid asset on their personal balance sheet. Building a fortress of independence is a lonely, exhausting process, especially when you have to lay the stones while you are still bleeding from the wounds they inflicted. It requires a level of strategic silence that others will inevitably mistake for weakness or compliance. But you and I know the truth about what happens in the quiet moments of preparation. We aren't just surviving, We are auditing every interaction and reinforcing every loophole until the structure is impenetrable to those who only know how to destroy. If you have ever had to build a fortress to protect yourself from the people who were supposed to be your home, this story is for you. It is a reminder that the ink on your own signature is more powerful than the name they gave you at birth. You are the sole architect of your future, and you do not owe a single cent of your peace to those who bet on your destruction to save themselves from their own poor choices. The $425,000 condo I fought for is now more than just a piece of real estate. It is the physical manifestation of a boundary that can never be crossed again. I look at my daughter, and I know that her legacy will be one of security and truth, far away from the vibrating growls and the predatory ledgers of the Miller family. Now that I have shared my audit of this betrayal and the steps I took to reclaim my life, I want to hear from you because your stories are the data that proves we are not alone in this fight. If you found out your parents sold your house while you were in a medical coma, what is the very first thing you would do once you woke up? Tell me your plan or share your own experience with family betrayal in the comments below. Let's build a world where our collective resilience becomes the strongest firewall against those who think they own us.